engagement there.
You're listening to Head South Radio with your host, Kat Meyer, a podcast dedicated to prioritizing pleasure and removing the stigma and shame around sex. We're here to be curious and have an open conversation about sexual health and relational wellness. This podcast is intended for educational and entertainment purposes. The information discussed is not a substitute for professional medical advice.
Hi, I'm your host, Kat Meyer. We recorded today's episode back in December. I think it's a pretty timely conversation about menstruation education. Our guest is a dear friend and mentor, Dr. Abby Paloma. Abby is an acupuncturist, women's health expert, yoga and meditation teacher, and an avid gardener. She treats a wide variety of conditions and invites her patients to pursue healing, nourishing, and harmonious ways of living. We discuss a variety of topics and myths around reproductive health and menstruation education. Like myself, Dr. Paloma is a firm believer in informed consent and providing patients with all the vital information they need to make critical decisions about their bodies. One technical note before we start, we had to record on an alternative platform, so some of the audio quality isn't as clear as my team and I would have liked. We apologize and appreciate your patience as we are learning and improving. Thank you all for listening, and it would be greatly appreciated if you like, subscribe, and leave a review and rating on whichever platforms you are listening to us on. We start with a quick meditation with all the episodes, so please find a comfortable seat and settle in. Settle into the seat, grounding down, lengthening the spine to grow a little bit taller, and find some buoyancy in the body. So from the integrity of our spine, can we find a sense of ease with our muscles? Noticing any areas that are tense or maybe holding with excitement. Try to soften and relax. Just taking a moment to acknowledge the breath, setting a personal intention for the next 45 minutes, and setting the intention for the podcast so that we can both share and connect and express the knowledge and the wisdom we've both gained and be curious. And then when you're ready, you'll just blink your eyes open, take in the space, take in the screen. Hi.
Hello.
Welcome.
Thank you.
So glad Dr. Abby Paloma is here with us to discuss many things. And so to get started, we have worked together in a yoga space, Sky Ting, and I have had the pleasure of training with you and learning from you about restorative yoga. But you're also a Chinese medicine practitioner. So I'd love for you to introduce yourself to our listeners, and then we can jump into the questions at hand.
Thanks, Kat. I'm really happy to be here. I'm a doctor of Chinese medicine and acupuncture. I practice both Chinese herbalism and Western herbalism, in addition to having taught yoga for the last 15 years. And I treat many things in my practice and focus more and more on reproductive health. I'm fascinated by all aspects of reproductive health and that journey and supporting women in fertile bodies. I am a very active gardener and support local food movement, and I practice both in Hudson, New York, and in New York City.
Cool. Amazing. So before we get started on your practice and the work that you're doing right now, what was your sex education or menstruation education like? So when you were growing up, what was your entry point, introduction point to reproductive health, sexual health, and or menstruation education?
Well, I would say first off, I was lucky that I had a mother who educated me about menstruation fairly early on and, was comfortable talking about sex at home as a kid when I had questions about it. So it wasn't something that was taboo per se as a child. As soon as I had questions, they were answered. But through school, I just remember these very awkward presentations by what I would say unskillful teachers. I remember, for example, a Spanish teacher was our sex ed teacher in part of high school, or we had a sex ed program. And I just remember how awkward he was in giving the information. And to be honest, also the co-ed aspect of having these classes, pubescent bodies and going through all the things that are normal in high school. And then adding like trying to absorb real sex education in a platform where the teachers are quite uncomfortable with the information themselves. And it's more of like a checklist rather than really a transmission, realizing the importance of the information and how it's going to affect these students' life. So my experience of sex ed was more kind of this routine aspect rather than I felt like proper education or even just the importance of the information that was given, the impact that that would be on the rest of my life.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that's a lot of people's standard is, and we're lucky. I too had a relationship with my mother where information was shared and discussed and like bodily things were normal and embracing conversation around that could happen. I know a lot of people didn't have that experience. So I feel very lucky to have had that experience, but I also in the same framework went to both a Catholic school and then a public school. So Catholic school was for like 5th, 6th, 7th grade. So junior high sex ed and around menstruation, and they separated us and put us in 2 separate rooms. We, boys in this room, girls in this room, and then you watch the video. And then in high school, it was exactly that, like whatever gym teacher, Spanish teacher, whoever they can like corral to do this job of teaching teenagers about sex. And I love how you framed it as like, it was probably a checklist. They were probably given like, this is what you need to cover for this to be done with, trying to get it done as quickly as possible and as painfully as possible, because it's probably painful for them. It's an interesting thing that recognizing it with my nieces and nephews who are now in that age, they're in high school going through it. It's the same program. Nothing has been updated. And so I'm curious as to if you can structure your own sex education, what does it look like and how is it different from because I feel like that it is in the I just had my 20-year high school reunion the other day. And so nothing has changed. When I talk to my niece, who is now 17, none of the information has been updated. There is nothing about pleasure. There's nothing about emotions or the experience we have with sex in our own bodies and how we frame and view our bodies. Body awareness is not even mentioned. It's just literally a checklist of this is how you put a condom on. This is birth control, if that's allowed in your state. And then that's about it. It's pretty much don't have sex because I don't want to be the person to teach you anything about it. So just don't do it is still the norm. And so I would be curious as to if you could create your own sex education program or reproductive health program.
We've had a conversation, I know, prior to this, and I would say that I daydream about a particular aspect of the sex education program and something that I have not been able to get active in yet, but I would like to volunteer and potentially give back and teach the younger generation about. And I think that a huge part of, separate from contraception and the act of sex, is the menstruation cycle. And I wish that that was addressed in a way that was more empowering to young people, and how crucial it is when women and menstruating people understand their cycle, the factors of fertility, how to track their cycle, if they have an irregular cycle, all the aspects of meaning that are derived from the menstrual cycle can be a deeply empowering process, or just have that information to be like, wow, I have the information to potentially know when I could get pregnant or not get pregnant. I have information beyond hormonal birth control. Not that I'm not an advocate for condoms as well, but there's other reasons, many safe uses for condoms, but having that information can be very empowering for your entire health, separate from whether you are preventing pregnancy or not. And I think the larger conversation about sex ed is, how do we create healthy bodies that can have sexual experiences as well? Healthy bodies for me starts with healthy menstruation, with people who menstruate.
Can you just give us a little understanding of what the menstrual cycle is? So imagining that someone in the audience is maybe a 15-year-old boy. He has no idea, male, cisgendered male, has no women in his life, doesn't know what the menstrual cycle is. What is that?
Yeah, I think that most people who don't understand anything about the science of it, there's this cultural belief system that kind of siphons it off of being like, oh, it's a woman's that time of the month where they're like bitchy and in pain, and that it's like this really horrible thing, rather than the menstrual cycle is the reason why we are all here and the most sacred thing that we have and how we generate life. So just starting with that the menstrual cycle is how we create life. Mm-hmm. And it is a change in hormones throughout the month in menstruating bodies. There's different phases. And the first phase is the follicular phase, basically, without going into too much in the science, is just stimulating the creation of an egg. And that takes a certain amount of days. And this is the standard cycle is based on a 28-day cycle. And the body preps the egg to be released, which is called ovulation. And then once the egg is released, it's either fertilized or not fertilized. And then you have the downswing where there's a whole different hormones that come in and then leads to menstruation, which would be the release of the uterine lining if there is not a pregnancy. I can go into far more detail, but I think for our purposes, that's probably good, right?
Yep. High level, this is what happens, just so we understand, everyone listening can understand that. Because I think a lot of people don't know, even menstruating humans don't know what the phases are and what's going on. They just know when there's bleeding and what to do with that. I feel like a lot of people don't even know what ovulation actually is in their body until they are ready to start conceiving children. Is like when they start actually thinking about their cycle in that depth. And I think we kind of had a conversation briefly at a wedding about that. A lot of patients who come to see you are at an age where they're ready and looking into their fertility, and only then recognizing, like, maybe if they came off of birth control, they didn't realize that that wasn't their actual period cycle. They weren't actually going through menstruation. And so then they don't really know their body yet. Like, there needs to be some time to understand your body and understand the different elements of the cycle and different things that you can recognize or see to understand when ovulation is happening. So like with a calendar method and tracking, but there's
fertility awareness.
Yes, exactly. And I believe you kind of briefly mentioned that that's something you work with your patients.
I'm chronically shocked because I have a lot of highly educated patients who come see me, and to realize how little they actually know about how their body works. That's what really got me more into the question of what are we teaching in sex ed and what is part of that program, and why would it not be really helpful for women to understand how to track their menstrual cycle. And many people have irregular menstrual cycles. And I would say the other part of my work, I don't know how much you wanted to go here, is that a core belief I have is the wish that birth control, hormonal birth control, is used for birth control purposes. And for that to be a choice of each person to say, this liberates me to feel like I have the power to use this contraception for contraceptive purposes and not for health purposes. And so many young people are given birth control without having any information about what a healthy cycle is and what is in the realm of what's the potential to actually create a healthy cycle outside of the classical Western medicine options, which the lowest hanging fruit with most gynecology providers, unfortunately, is if you have any type of menstrual irregularity, dysfunction, PMS symptoms, headaches in relationship to your cycle, you are given hormonal birth control, not for birth control purposes, but to quote unquote cure your menstrual dysfunction, which is no cure at all and actually can cause, there's a variety of side effects, but what I'm just on the very surface level interested in this conversation is like how disempowering that is to be cut off from one of your most vital health signs. The term of the fifth vital sign was termed for healthy menstruation, which is what Chinese medicine has been talking about for thousands of years. That if your menstrual cycle is not healthy, that's telling us that there's something else going on in your body as well.
Understanding the whole system holistically rather than just like, oh, that's what's interesting too, is I got on birth control because I wanted to be on birth control because I knew I was going to be having sex. Like I made that decision. I spoke to the doctor. I got all of the information I needed. when I was 17 with my mother and made the choice. It wasn't because I was having cramps, but I believe my younger sister was having cramps and was being sent home from school because of how painful her periods were. And so she was put on birth control much younger than me, and not because she was sexually active or in that mindset. It was more of exactly what you're saying, is like, it was a treat all in a weird, bizarre sense, rather than being like, oh, maybe she's experiencing this because of her diet. Maybe she's experiencing these like heavy periods and symptoms. And what can we do? Like you said, change diet, exercise, whatever it is that you can use to treat
herbs and acupuncture.
Exactly. The period cramps. But instead it was just like, here's a hormonal pill that you're going to be on and good luck to you. And I experienced this too. And I had gone through 10 years of being on hormonal birth control and, realizing like emotionally how disturbing that was and not being able to fully experience certain feelings or feeling feelings in a way that felt foreign. There's not a lot of talk around that either, of the aspects of the hormones being so affected that it affects how you experience the world. And they would switch the dosage, or like a new brand came out and like the doctors would just switch it out and like not explain what was happening. It got to a point where I was like, I am done. I can't do this anymore after 10 years of being on it. And I think a lot of women have experienced that.
I mean, I can understand in this particular historical moment that we're in, I believe that the right to have access to hormonal birth control and other forms of contraception is extremely, extremely important and should be protected by our government in all of our states. And on the other side of that, there are so many other options to treat any type of menstrual irregularity, from dysmenorrhea, which is pain during periods, to PCOS, to irregular cycles, to a variety of other things related to the menstrual cycle. I wish that there were just more avenues in education to empower people about other options instead of just turning to hormonal birth control.
I think that's absolutely right. We should have the right to access all of the things and all of the information and then make the choices for our bodies. People are making decisions that aren't about their bodies or their experience. And then we're not being educated enough to know what are all of the options to then make the right decision. And that's all we want, is the ability to make the right decisions for ourselves and have the information accessible.
Yeah. And I think it's a much larger question, but it really brings into the dialogue of what you're describing is informed consent, which is one of the most important and vital processes of any healthcare provider in my belief system. Mm-hmm. And expecting 16-year-olds to have proper informed consent about the risks and use of birth control, or a variety actually of other surgical options or things that happen to young people without proper informed consent. I mean, this is where it comes into, like, when I'm shocked that I'm meeting women in their 30s finally deciding to get pregnant and having no idea about their cycle. If highly educated people don't understand, how do we expect our youth to go into an office with a doctor where there's a clear power structure, to feel like they don't know that much, and to feel like they actually can ask the right questions, have advocate for the information, gather all the information, and make the choice that is best for them.
Yeah, I think it's creating spaces where people can feel empowered by being curious, empowering them to be curious and ask more. And it's hard when the system is not structured that way.
Or you live in a state that those are not options, and your doctor may be guiding you against proper contraception.
It's quite disappointing. And so this type of platform, a podcast where people can hear and listen and take in information that they might not have access to, depending on where they live, depending on their demographic, all of the factors. What are some myths or misunderstandings that you would like people to understand about menstruation or their periods, or things that come up for you that you're like, oh, that you've had to educate menstruating humans on, or people in general? Because I feel like that's the other part of the conversation, is that it's so gendered. It actually should be a universal understanding, like regardless of gender, you should understand reproductive health, all sides of reproduction and life.
Yeah, I agree. Anyone who either is menstruating or non-menstruating, I think that our entire world would benefit from understanding the menstrual cycle. I do understand as a human that you might be less curious to understand in depth if it's not something that your body is going through monthly. But a lot of the myths, I feel like first and foremost, to be honest, is one of the myths about birth control. How many people say, well, I'm on my period week. So the myth that you are actually having a menstrual cycle while on birth control is something that I just find somewhat alarming. Some people would be like, that's such a moot point. Why does it matter? They're having some form of bleeding. But the point is that a healthy cycle is all those phases of follicular phase, ovulation, luteal phase, menstruation. And in that, there's a whole cascade of hormones that happen. And hormones don't just do one thing. They have so many different actions and trigger so many different cascades of neurotransmitter responses, et cetera, through the body. And there is a basic health to having a cycle. So when you are taking hormonal birth control, the body basically goes into a state of false pregnancy. And that, for a prolonged period of time, many doctors would say, doesn't have any risks, but you are literally changing your chemistry, changing your hormonal response, neurotransmitter productions, a whole variety of things in relationship to that. And so one of the myths is that I wish that people were in fully informed consent about that choice that they're making when they choose that, and that it does have an effect on the body. And that connected to that, this healthy menstrual cycle is the groundwork for health in general. So that, I would say, is an opinion and a belief system. I mean, some would say facts, but in the Chinese medicine system, that if a patient, for example, comes in for maybe back pain or chronic headaches or things like that, and then I find out that they also have extreme menstrual pain, even if they're not coming in for that as their chief complaint, I will continue to track the progress of their menstrual pain, because I know if their menstrual pain gets better, their overall constitutional health is improving, and that as a marker will likely be feeding into the reasons why they're also coming in.
It starts to make you think. And now I'm 10 years off of hormonal birth control and seeing my own health improve. And I very rarely, if I go in with something, I very rarely have deep conversations about my menstrual cycle, unless that doctor, and in recent years, I've had a doctor who also works with naturopaths as well as Western medicine. And so that's been really helpful to work with that type of practitioner, because they have deeper conversations around my body and it's more holistic. I work with a team of doctors and they all communicate and understand that it's just not one approach dealing with one thing, a system of people that are working with the system of the body. There is very rarely, I've noticed, conversation around the menstrual health unless it's specifically the menstrual health. There's something off, or I had cysts on my ovaries at one point and that's when it was dealt with. But prior to that, there was no conversations about period health and cycle and how I felt about it or how I felt coming off. There was no transition either. When I came off of it, there was nothing working with the doctors that I had then. There was nothing to help me understand what was going to happen to my body as I came off of that. And there is a transition. Can you speak to that? Because I know a lot of women right now are kind of transitioning to that or seeking more alternative contraception as they're starting to look into fertility, but not ready to start conceiving, but are kind of coming off of hormonal birth control. What is that transition process like, and what is your recommendation? Or
I do want to answer that question, but I want to add one other thing. Just how we gauge the health of the menstrual cycle. And I think that's really important for people to understand. So in my medical system, there are so many measures and metrics of menstrual health that most Western gynecologists don't care at all about and don't think that they actually have any information. How your period, how the bleeding starts. Does it start red? Does it start brown? Does it start black? Does it start heavy? Do you spot for a few days before the real bleed actually starts? Then once the bleeding starts, is the blood thick? Is it really thin? Is it pale? The color of it, the pain, how many days you're actually bleeding for. again, does it end or does it like drag on? And is it dark and brown? There's so many factors within the cycle that Chinese medicine, East Asian medicine has been tracking these symptoms and has a correlation to what would be like ideal for the health of the person. These are measures that I've never been asked by any gynecologist ever that is important. So some of the things that I do with patients and just with myths is getting people to actually know their cycle, to like, when do you have cervical mucus? When do you not? This is all such important information to the functioning of our body. I think going back to the myths is just to create a curiosity rather than just being like, I don't want to know. My body just does whatever it does. But if we actually understand what these symptoms and metrics mean and can translate and could inform us that maybe we're not in the best health or maybe we are in better health or whatever that means, can empower our decisions and how we choose to take care of ourselves.
I have one point of that because you just made me realize that when I had the cyst on my ovaries, I hadn't noticed. I thought it was just another period. Like I wasn't paying attention. I wasn't tracking my period. I was just like, oh, my period's back again. That kept happening. And it kept happening so frequently that my partner at one point, like, and it would happen accidentally. And I'd be like, oh my God, like we'd be out somewhere and I'd panic and be like, I got my period. Like maybe I wasn't paying attention. I don't know. Maybe I'm syncing with somebody else at work or something's going on. I just was so unaware of the fact that it was happening because it was spotting. And it was more, I then went to a gynecologist and I didn't get answers. And then I was seeing a Chinese medicine practitioner who then recognized that like, oh, your cycle is completely off. There's something going on here. Go back to your gynecologist. And then we discovered that I had cysts on my ovaries and that was what was causing in between bleeding. And I thought I was just like having frequent periods or like my period was like moving, but like moving in a way that was jumping time and catching me off guard. And I didn't recognize that there was something else going on because that was the symptom. That was the thing that was happening. And then with the help of the Chinese medicine practitioner and her teaching me how to track my cycle and really observe it was where I discovered like, oh no, this is not normal. This is not a period that's just moving shifting a few days. It was happening more and more frequently and just spotting all over the place and just not recognize, like just thinking that was my period. And thankfully that I was able to have a procedure and have that all taken care of, but it took much longer because I didn't recognize that in myself. Like I was just ignorant to the fact of like my period and my cycle and the timing of it and just thought that this was normal. That's one of the ways that you can empower yourself. And that's where I started to empower myself and learn about my cycle and learn about my own healthcare in a more deep and intimate way. And so that's where I feel like that's the benefit of that type of understanding.
I personally as well have had endometriosis and endometriomas, which are cysts related to endometriosis. And I remember in my early 20s, the first time that was diagnosed, it's just like, oh yeah, here's birth control. We're just going to stop the estrogen levels in your body. Mm-hmm. And that was the end of the discussion. There was no other discussion. Mm-hmm. So all this information that I'm sharing stemmed from personal experience, partially, just having to be on the receiving end of a system that I feel didn't show me all the other options that were available or even consider them.
Thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
So back to the question that I had before of what the transition off of birth control, because I feel like a lot of people are in that. A lot of people who would be listening would be considering that, or also when you're getting on birth control. So listening to this at a time when you're maybe considering birth control, understanding what that looks like coming off of it as well, because at some point you may or will have to come off of birth control.
Yeah. I have some patients who get off birth control and get pregnant immediately. They go right back to their normal cycle. And I mean, those are people who are seeking to get pregnant. But part of how I answer that question is, where were you when you started birth control? Did you have a healthy cycle? Some people are so removed from what their menstruating life was prior to birth control, they can't even remember. I'm like, oh, did I get headaches? Did I bleed regularly? Did I have a lot of pain? So oftentimes, if you started birth control wherever you were and you had an irregular cycle and you stop, you might still have that irregular cycle after however many years you've been on birth control. having some awareness of where you were before you started, I think will help you transition into understanding what your cycle may be when you stop. On the other side, some people who come off birth control can take several months to actually regain proper ovulation, proper menstruation within some form of 28-day cycle. I always tell patients, as far as the metric of a 28-day cycle, is consistency with yourself is greater than consistency with 28-day cycle. So some people are on a 24-day cycle and they are on that cycle. And some people are on a 32-day cycle and that's more their cycle, or within a range of, I would say, 1 to 3 days is healthy. So if you're menstruating anywhere from like day 27 to day 29 with good consistency, that is what I would call a healthy cycle length. And it doesn't mean that everyone has to be 28 days. And if you're not 28 days, that is not healthy. Surprisingly, I would say that a lot of people feel their moods totally change after coming off birth control. I've seen many people want to come off because they feel like it can exacerbate depression and depressive qualities. Sometimes can cause people to gain weight, but just reconnecting with this hormonal cycle on your own terms in your body can give people an experience just feeling more themselves. And the other side can be true of, say, you had some type of menstrual dysregularity that you don't even remember because you were put on birth control at such a young age. Coming off it can be shocking in the sense that you are experiencing symptoms and things that you never confronted prior, which may still just be there kind of in the depths.
Underlying waiting. And then if I think back to my experience of coming off of it, I did feel a much lighter sense of clarity. It's when I started meditating. So I started then finding other sources to help with moods and thought. I think a lot for me, that was a lot of heaviness with the being on the hormonal birth control. There was a lot of intrusive thought, a lot of what would be described as like PMS experience and like emotional release. And so then since coming off of that I helped myself was finding yoga and meditating and finding sources of outlet. I found much more clarity of thought. And so even though I might have that just before my period where I get a little fuzzy or feel a bit overwhelmed, it's better than feeling like that all the time when I was on the birth control. So that's definitely one of the transitions I took on, is that you then start to look at your diet, look at other things to then help kind of manage your period rather than utilizing a pill that was kind of this neutral. I felt like I was neutralized in a way of like not experiencing my body. And
well, the myth that it's not invasive is what perturbs me. Like I said, if you choose that this is the best option for you and your lifestyle, I'm like, yeah, get it, do it. Like, that's your choice. Awesome. But being informed that hormonal birth control is not non-invasive, it's not going to affect other aspects of your health. Also, the presentation that there are, I consider herbs and acupuncture as varying in lifestyle changes and food changes and exercise changes and quality of sleep changes and all these things as far less invasive than hormonal supplementation. And if people were informed that there were other options that were less invasive to solve some of these issues, that's the world that I want to live in.
I do think that with the hormonal birth control, there's all those side effects they say really quickly at the very end in the, advertising. It's the very tiny print at the bottom. It's like, that's real things. Those are real things that then you have to deal with and experience, just being swept under the rug as like this, that's the new normal. And that's okay because the benefits of this for some outweigh, but it's like, why is this happening? And why should we accept that as the normal when there's other alternatives? Like you're saying, there's other things, especially when it's used as a treatment for menstruation rather than as a contraception.
Yeah. I mean, I can't tell you how many patients I've had who come to see me because they have full-blown horrific migraines with aura and they're still on hormonal birth control. And migraines with aura, by the books, is a huge contraindication. for taking hormonal birth control, which could be linked to blood clotting and stroke. And I just find it interesting that I'm the one who educates these patients about this rather than the prescribing physicians. And it's not trying to, boost my ego. It's more just a vignette of what our health system is and where people are getting information from.
Where there is definitely room for improvement and more clarity on these conversations. It's like,
yeah. And the people who usually walk through my office are at a certain level of privilege that can have accessibility and afford alternative healthcare options, which tells me that this information is not getting to a lot of people who need it.
Masses. And that actually leads me to my next question of, a lot of holistic healthcare can be intimidating for people, and people listening might be like, that's out of my realm. That's out of my reach because I can't afford that. Or that's out of my reach because I don't live in New York City, things like that can kind of prohibit people from exploring this type of work and getting these kinds of resources. What are some ways that you can direct people to finding these resources, or what are some things that they can do that wouldn't prohibit them from even just getting beyond this podcast? Where else can they get this kind of information?
Yeah. Well, first of all, there's so many resources nowadays through podcasts and people who share so much information on Instagram, and amazing physicians that are promoting real options for women's health, reproductive health. So we do live in a world where a lot of it's accessible, but you need to still know where to look. And I would say that there's acupuncturists and herbalists all over the country as well. And a lot of cities or even small towns have, whether it's not private practice, there's different community acupuncture forums, which are options for reduced income, lower income options. Health insurance in general, many plans don't cover or have acupuncture benefits, but some do. So researching if that is within your plan and that you can get support getting alternative services. I would say outside of Chinese medicine and acupuncture, there's also naturopaths, even Western herbalists that are trained in a way that can help support health through non-invasive other options. I can give you a list later, but name a bunch of resources of people who I think are doing really great work. I think Aviva Ram is doing great work. I think Lisa Hendrickson-Jack is doing great work. Lara Bryden. There's so many menstrual revolutionaries, women's health people who want to get good information out and make it accessible to all. So whether you're actually getting acupuncture or herbal treatment, at least finding the information that's going to help you get to the right place.
Thank you so much for sharing those resources. Wild card question. A most romantic moment or a sex scene from a film?
I don't know if it's a sex scene, but it's a love movie. Call Me by Your Name.
Mm-hmm.
I just love that movie so much. And I've recently realized that a lot of other people have different opinions about it, but I think it's just this expression of first love and embracing sexuality as well. So there are sex scenes in that movie, but just in general, the way I think first of all, the movie can apply to hetero or homosexual first love, that I just think it's a beautiful expression of love in general, but particularly young person exploring their sexuality with the support of their parents and being open to find and express their ways of love in ways that during that time, even in like the 80s, were not always welcomed and expressed. So I really love the message, some of the messages in that.
I agree with you. I feel like it's such a beautiful distillment of aliveness from being attracted to somebody else and kind of being curious and not knowing, and the way that, the writers and directors and the actors depicted that. It's very universal, that experience of like not knowing, being a bit nervous, and then to see the main character's name, Elio, his relationship and communication with his father, talking about relationship and love. And that is so beautiful. And I think I appreciate you sharing that, because I think it's such a universal experience to have, is the aliveness, the excitement, even the heartbreak. They show the full breadth of first love. And I love that.
And also that it's yes, there was a sexual component. Obviously, their hormones were going crazy, but the intellectual love and like the mutual admiration for each other and their intellectual flirtation and the way that that was shot on screen was just really beautiful as well. That there was a poetry and a romantic quality to it. It wasn't just pure, this like kind of young sexual attraction as well.
It was definitely, I love that. There's an energetic component. There's an intellectual component. There's a like pushback, like didn't know what to think of that. At first he was kind of criticizing him. That kind of experience is very true to first love. I think it's the whole gamut of emotions and experience and connection that you can have with someone. So it's not just a sexual connection and like partying teens getting drunk and doing this thing, but it was like this whole song and dance. Yeah, that's a great one. So to wrap up, how can people connect with you? How do they find you, and what are you wanting to share, or how do you want people to?
Yeah, my website is abbypaloma.com. Information about my Hudson and New York City practice and different teaching, mostly restorative yoga and seasonal wellness courses. And I'm in the works of building a healing center here in Hudson. The working title might change, but right now it's Paloma Healing Center. And part of my goal for this healing center is to create access to alternative healthcare for people in the community. And what else? I have a little bit of an Instagram presence, just at Abby Paloma. I don't want people to spend more time there than they should, but I do try to share things that I think are valuable.
And your newsletter.
You can also, through my website, you can join my newsletter, and I have seasonal wellness tips there. And for me, one of the things, while I have a very scientific brain and my background is in science and I like to talk about healthcare, I love poetry, and I love sharing poetry through living through the season. So that's one of the things that inspires me, that I like to communicate to people, to be inspired by seasonal living.
I love your newsletter, and that's where I appreciate that type of work. And I think that's an offering that doesn't require you to be on social media. It's really lovely. I encourage people to sign up for your newsletter to get those little seasonal, it's kind of like a download that you offer in like a beautiful way. And yeah, I think that's all I have. Yeah. And I'm excited to see where your Paloma Center goes. I'm excited to come visit it. And so congratulations on that, because I know that was a big thing for you. And to birth concepts it's an incredible experience. So I'm so proud of you. I'm so happy for you.
Thank you, Kat. Yeah, no, thanks for inviting me to be here, and may people suffer less through this information.
A beautiful way to close. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Special thanks to all of our guests. Head South is hosted by Kat Meyer, produced by Isis Barlow, edited by Megan Hook, with music by Lily Rezi Rothman, graphics by Ella Chodos Irvine, cover art by Gina Ship Casey, and intro by Murph Meyer.
If you're looking for me, I'm heading south. All year round, I'm going down. Now you know where I'll be, I'm heading south. So come on, look me right in the mouth.